Intro. The Silent Mindset explores the transformative power of inner stillness in a noisy, fast-paced world. Rather than chasing constant stimulation, this book encourages the reader to cultivate silence. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of awareness, discipline, and mental clarity. Through stories, insights, and practical tools, it teaches how silence becomes strength. Introduction. In an age dominated by constant noise, social media, news alerts, the pressure to always respond, react, and perform, the value of silence has never been more relevant, yet more neglected. The Silent Mindset presents a deliberate shift away from overstimulation toward the profound power of inner stillness, not as a spiritual abstraction or retreat from life, but as a form of psychological discipline and conscious self-mastery. In a world where everyone is talking, posting, and rushing to be seen or heard, silence becomes a rare and revolutionary act. It's not the absence of sound but the presence of awareness. This mindset is not about withdrawing from communication or avoiding challenges, but about how we engage with life, thoughtfully, intentionally, and with emotional control. True silence means not being dominated by internal noise, the spiraling thoughts, the doubts, the fears, the unfiltered reactivity that drive much of our behavior. Cultivating a silent mindset means developing the capacity to respond rather than react, to observe without judgment, and to act with clarity even during chaos. It's about training the mind to pause before it speaks and, more importantly, to listen, not just to others but to us. In doing so, we reclaim our energy from distractions and use it to build depth, insight, and a kind of quiet confidence that cannot be shaken by external noise. This book does not preach escapism or silence for the sake of passivity. Rather, it guides readers to embrace silence as a tool of strength, a way to filter out the irrelevant and focus on what truly matters. Through personal stories, psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and practical exercises, the chapters ahead demonstrate how the silent mindset can elevate relationships, leadership, productivity, and inner peace. From the boardroom to the classroom, from intimate conversations to moments of solitude, those who harness silence as a mindset often lead with greater clarity, earn deeper trust, and achieve more with less drama. The journey toward the silent mindset begins with awareness of how much unnecessary noise we carry with us every day, both around us and within us. We live in a culture that rewards quick replies, hot takes, constant validation, and the illusion that louder equals stronger. Yet when we examine the most powerful moments of transformation, whether personal breakthroughs, meaningful conversations, or acts of courage, they are often born not in noise but in pause, in silence. The silent mindset is not a personality type. It's not only for introverts or monks. It's a learned skill accessible to anyone willing to practice the art of restraint, stillness, and observation. It's the executive who takes time to listen before deciding, the partner who pauses before speaking in anger, the athlete who maintains focus under pressure, the artist who finds inspiration not in frenzy but in calm. Every individual can benefit from this inner quiet, because it fosters a kind of power that doesn't need to shout. It's a shift from proving to being, from reacting to choosing, from noise to signal. As the world becomes louder and more chaotic, the ability to remain centered, composed, and focused becomes a rare superpower. Those who can cultivate this mindset are not disconnected. They are simply no longer ruled by distraction. They learn to trust their inner compass, guided not by external approval, but by internal clarity. And while silence may seem like a void to those who fear it, the truth is that silence is full of insight, truth, awareness, and potential. The silent mindset gives you space to think clearly, to see patterns others miss, and to act with a precision that noisy minds often cannot reach. As you explore the ideas in this book, you'll see that silence is not a passive state, but a dynamic process of filtering, refining, and strengthening. It requires effort, patience, and humility, but it rewards you with peace, control, and a deeper understanding of yourself and the world. Whether you're facing personal turmoil, leadership challenges, emotional overwhelm, or simply the desire to live more intentionally, the silent mindset offers a path forward. It's not about being quiet for the sake of quiet but becoming quiet enough to hear what really matters. In this world of noise, where everyone is trying to speak louder and faster, those who choose silence, and master it, gain the ultimate advantage, the ability to act with calm certainty, to lead without arrogance, and to live without being constantly pulled off course. The silent mindset is an invitation to experience life not more loudly but more deeply. It's a mindset that will challenge you, ground you, and ultimately empower you to thrive, not by adding more noise but by removing what no longer serves you. Chapter 1: The Noise Within delves into the often overlooked chaos that resides not in our external environment, but within our own minds, an invisible, incessant storm of thoughts, doubts, fears, judgments, imagined conversations, regrets of the past, anxieties about the future, and a relentless inner monologue that rarely allows us to simply be present. This chapter begins by helping the reader recognize that this inner noise is not only common but normalized in a culture that glorifies busyness, overthinking, multitasking, and constant mental stimulation, so much so that silence feels foreign or even uncomfortable. The mind, left unchecked, becomes a noisy roommate we cannot escape, a commentator on every moment, a critic of our every action, a predictor of worst-case scenarios, and a compulsive narrator of things that haven't even happened. This inner noise often masquerades as productivity or preparation, but it's a form of internal clutter that drains emotional energy, weakens decision-making, and causes unnecessary stress. The chapter draws from cognitive psychology and neuroscience to explain how this noise originates largely from our brain's default mode network, the state the mind returns to when it's not focused on a task, where it wanders, replays memories, imagines futures, and judges both self and others, often negatively. But instead of reacting with shame or frustration, the noise within teaches that the first step to a silent mindset is not suppressing this inner voice but becoming aware of it without identifying with it. The mind will produce noise, that's its nature. The problem arises when we confuse our thoughts with truth or believe we are our thoughts. By illustrating common examples, like how a single critical comment can echo in our minds for hours, or how we construct entire emotional reactions based on assumptions, we begin to see how often our inner world distorts reality and keeps us stuck in loops of overreaction. The chapter emphasizes that mental noise is not just a personal problem, it's a collective one, reinforced by constant digital input, social comparison, and the fear of missing out. We've trained our minds to seek distraction and stimulation to avoid confronting the silence that might reveal uncomfortable truths about our emotions, our purpose, or the choices we've made. Social media, for instance, adds layers to our inner noise, by feeding our comparison instincts, amplifying our self-judgment, and encouraging constant mental narration about how we're perceived. But the real danger of inner noise is not just its volume, it's that it subtly controls our behavior. We become reactive, defensive, anxious, easily manipulated by emotions or triggered by words. We may believe we're making conscious decisions when in fact, we're simply acting out thought patterns we've never examined. The noise within encourages readers to step back and observe this internal activity with curiosity rather than judgment. Through self-awareness practices like mindful breathing, journaling, and intentional pauses in conversation, we learn to create space between stimulus and response. This space is where the silent mindset begins to emerge, not as an empty void, but as a powerful field of clarity, where the mind is no longer a master but a tool. The chapter also introduces the concept of mental fasting, moments when we deliberately disengage from information overload, avoid unnecessary conversations, or sit in stillness, not for relaxation alone, but to rewire the brain away from constant chatter. It draws parallels between physical clutter and mental clutter. Just as a crowded room limits movement, a crowded mind limits insight, creativity, and peace. By examining the roots of our noise, fear of failure, need for approval, unresolved guilt, we begin to trace how much of our inner turmoil is self-created and sustained by unconscious habits. We begin to realize how many of our so-called problems are magnified or even invented by the stories we constantly tell ourselves. The chapter challenges the reader to consider, who are you beneath the noise? What happens when the mental commentary pauses? Most people have never lived long in that space of inner stillness because the noise feels safer. It keeps us busy, distracted, and comfortable in our patterns. But comfort is not clarity. To step into the silent mindset, we must risk discomfort long enough to meet ourselves beneath the surface. The noise within doesn't promise instant silence, but it offers a path, a movement from compulsion to consciousness, from over-identification to observation, from reaction to intention. It suggests that when we quiet the internal storm even slightly, we start to hear a deeper voice, the one that doesn't shout but guides. This is the voice of awareness, intuition, and deep presence. In the final sections, the chapter offers simple but powerful exercises, a 5-minute daily silence practice, a mental decluttering technique to identify repeating thought patterns, and a journaling prompt to notice which inner voices dominate and whether they are truly ours or inherited from childhood, society, or trauma. It reinforces that the mind isn't the enemy, noise isn't evil, it's just untrained. Like a wild horse, the untrained mind will run wherever it pleases, often into stress, judgment, or distraction. But with awareness and practice, we can ride that horse instead of being dragged by it. By the end of the chapter, readers are no longer just aware of their inner noise, they're equipped to begin changing their relationship with it. They understand that silence is not a state we wait for but a practice we create, and the first battlefield is always within. The chapter closes with this realization, that the greatest obstacle to peace, clarity, and strength is not what's happening around us, but the noise we allow to dominate within us, and that by learning to quiet it, we unlock a kind of freedom that external silence alone can never give. Chapter 2, Choosing Stillness, builds upon the awareness of internal noise explored in the previous chapter by making a bold claim, that stillness is not something we stumble upon or receive passively, but a conscious decision, a choice we must make repeatedly in a world designed to distract, provoke, and consume our attention. Stillness is not merely the absence of movement or sound. It is an active engagement with the present moment, a discipline of pausing and grounding ourselves in awareness even while the world races on around us. In this chapter, stillness is reframed as a powerful internal stance, not the surrender of energy but the redirection of it, not withdrawal from life but presence within it. Many people imagine stillness as a state of detachment, laziness, or weakness, but the book dismantles this misconception by showing that stillness often takes more strength than reaction. Choosing stillness means interrupting the urge to speak when silence would serve better, holding back judgment when listening is more valuable, and staying centered in the face of provocation, chaos, or fear. The chapter explores how, in modern culture, motion is equated with progress and noise with significance. We are taught from an early age to stay busy, stay loud, stay moving, but never taught how to stop meaningfully. Choosing stillness invites the reader to examine the cost of this conditioning, showing how constant doing without reflective being leads to burnout, confusion, and misaligned action. Stillness, in contrast, becomes the place where true alignment happens, where we gain clarity not only on what to do but on why we're doing it. Through stories of thinkers, warriors, leaders, and creatives throughout history, people who accessed extraordinary insight by stepping back before stepping forward, the chapter illustrates that stillness precedes intelligent action. It is not passivity but preparation, not avoidance but precision. In high-stakes environments, from crisis negotiation to battlefield command to creative invention, the people who choose stillness are often the ones who maintain clarity, control, and influence. The chapter also tackles the discomfort that often arises when one first tries to be still, how the mind resists, the body fidgets, the emotions surface, and the old patterns scream for activity. But here, it suggests, is the gateway. When we sit in that discomfort without fleeing, we begin to take back authority over our internal state. Stillness requires courage because it means facing what movement often helps us avoid: uncertainty, vulnerability, truth. But choosing stillness gives us access to a dimension of life that constant motion cannot reach. It is in stillness that our intuition speaks, that our nervous system resets, that our truest motivations become visible. This chapter makes the distinction between enforced stillness, like being stuck, frozen, or silenced, and chosen stillness, which is empowering and intentional. The former is rooted in fear and helplessness, the latter is rooted in strength and discernment. Choosing stillness in the middle of chaos doesn't mean ignoring the chaos, it means deciding not to be owned by it. The text introduces the idea of micro-moments of stillness, where even in the busiest day, we can create seconds of inward pause, a breath before responding, a moment of mental space before entering a room, a check-in with our emotions before replying to an email. These tiny choices, compounded, retrain the nervous system and recondition the mind toward responsiveness instead of reactivity. The chapter also highlights how stillness enhances perception. When we slow down internally, we notice more about others, about situations, about ourselves. It's not that still people see less, it's that they've trained themselves to see deeper. Choosing stillness creates room for reflection, and reflection creates room for wiser decisions. The chapter integrates insights from neuroscience, showing how the brain's prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function, decision-making, and emotional regulation, is most active when we're calm and grounded, while the amygdala, our fight-or-flight center, dominates when we're in reactive, noisy states. Stillness, then, is not a luxury, it's a biological requirement for clarity, leadership, and sustained well-being. The chapter invites readers to view stillness not as a thing to find in nature or silence, but a muscle they can strengthen within themselves through deliberate practice. That practice might take many forms: meditation, slow walks without devices, journaling, deep breathing, or simply sitting without trying to solve or fix anything. But the goal remains the same: to re-establish inner leadership over one's mental and emotional states. The modern world glorifies urgency, but urgency is often a trap. an illusion that compels us to act before we understand. Choosing stillness cuts through this illusion. It gives us the radical power to say, I don't need to rush into action to have worth. I don't need to react to every provocation to prove strength. In stillness, we begin to move from intention rather than compulsion. The chapter concludes by emphasizing that stillness is not a one-time decision. It is a mindset we recommit to each time we are tempted to react, to escape, to control. It is the refusal to be owned by circumstance, the choice to remain grounded even when the ground feels shaky. Choosing stillness doesn't mean we stop engaging with life. It means we stop letting life push us around. It means we start creating from the inside out. In this way, stillness becomes a form of quiet rebellion against a noisy, anxious world, and a path back to the essence of who we are beneath the rush, beneath the roles, beneath the restlessness. Choosing stillness is ultimately about reclaiming authorship over our own lives, moment by moment, breath by breath, silence by silence. Chapter 3: Discipline of Thought confronts one of the most fundamental truths about the human experience, that while we cannot always control what happens to us, we can learn to govern how we think about it, and introduces thought discipline as the backbone of the silent mindset. In this chapter, the reader is guided to understand that our thoughts are not merely reactions to reality, but powerful creators of perception, emotion, and behavior. Most people live as if thoughts are facts, letting their inner narratives run wild, unquestioned and unchallenged, forming loops of negativity, fear, judgment, or distraction that shape their lives more than external events ever could. But the silent mindset recognizes that freedom begins where unconscious thought patterns end. Discipline of thought doesn't mean suppression or denial. It means cultivating awareness, intention, and control over the stories we allow to live in our minds. This chapter explores how undisciplined thinking fuels anxiety, emotional outbursts, impulsive behavior, and mental exhaustion. It explains that just as an untrained body cannot perform at its peak, an untrained mind cannot remain calm, focused, or effective under pressure. Thought discipline involves learning to filter the noise, direct attention purposefully, and choose interpretations that empower rather than paralyze. Drawing on cognitive behavioral principles, neuroscience, and ancient wisdom traditions, the chapter shows how every thought we have activates a chain reaction: emotion, physiological response, action, and consequence, and how mastering the first link in that chain gives us unprecedented influence over the rest. The chapter distinguishes between automatic thoughts, the knee-jerk inner commentary shaped by habit, fear, ego, or past trauma, and chosen thoughts, which are conscious, intentional responses aligned with our values and goals. Most of our suffering, it argues, doesn't come from events themselves but from the meaning we assign to them. Thus, discipline of thought is about mastering the art of interpretation. The book offers real-life scenarios, such as receiving criticism, facing uncertainty, or dealing with failure, and breaks down how thought discipline allows a person to slow the moment down, observe the reactive thoughts arising, and replace them with a more grounded perspective. Rather than catastrophizing or personalizing, a disciplined mind asks, is this true? Is this helpful? What else could be true here? This inner dialogue creates space between stimulus and response, and in that space lies our power. The chapter also explores how most people allow external forces, social media, news cycles, gossip, and peer pressure, to hijack their attention and direct their thoughts without consent. Thought discipline is the antidote to mental manipulation. It is the process of reclaiming ownership over what we allow to take root in our mind, treating attention as a sacred resource, not to be spent casually on anything loud or trending. Just as athletes train their bodies through repetition and rest, disciplined thinkers train their minds through mindfulness, metacognition, thinking about thinking, and the conscious reframing of inner narratives. The chapter gives practical tools such as mental labeling, identifying thought types like fear, judgment, comparison, cognitive diffusion, seeing thoughts as mental events, not truths, and the thought journal, writing and reviewing recurring thoughts to expose patterns. It emphasizes that the goal is not to achieve perfect positivity or constant calm, but to become someone who can catch a spiraling thought and redirect it before it takes over. Importantly, the chapter clarifies that thought discipline is not cold logic or robotic thinking. It's emotional maturity. It's the capacity to feel deeply but not be ruled by emotion, to acknowledge pain without turning it into identity, to hold opposing ideas and still choose clarity. It's what allows us to move through challenges with presence and purpose rather than panic or paralysis. The disciplined thinker doesn't react immediately. They investigate, reflect, and respond with integrity. The chapter ties this practice into everyday examples: how we speak to ourselves in the mirror, how we interpret someone else's silence, how we deal with rejection or mistakes, how we imagine our future. Each moment becomes an opportunity to choose thoughts that align with strength, growth, and inner peace, rather than those that reinforce fear, resentment, or helplessness. This shift from unconscious to conscious thinking doesn't happen overnight. It requires practice, patience, and humility, because it reveals just how much of our suffering we've co-created through mental habits we never questioned. But with consistency, thought discipline builds mental resilience, the ability to stay steady even when life isn't. It allows us to hold focus in a distracted world, maintain direction amid uncertainty, and stay true to ourselves even when external opinions attempt to pull us off course. Toward the end of the chapter, the reader is reminded that the mind is like a garden. It will grow something no matter what. Without discipline, it grows weeds, fear, anger, insecurity, and endless mental clutter. With discipline, it can grow clarity, creativity, emotional stability, and vision. We become what we repeatedly think, so mastering thought is not just mental hygiene, it's identity formation. The chapter ends with a clear challenge: to begin each day by observing the first thoughts that arise, to journal them without judgment, and to practice replacing any that are fear-based, self-defeating, or irrelevant with thoughts grounded in truth, possibility, and personal responsibility. In time, this becomes more than a mental habit, it becomes a way of living. And when thought becomes disciplined, silence is no longer a place we try to reach. It becomes the natural atmosphere of our mind. Discipline of thought, then, is not about rigidity, it is about freedom. It is about learning to think clearly so we can live fully, and in doing so, unlock the stillness and power that noise can never offer. Chapter 4: Listening Without Speaking shifts the focus from internal mastery to interpersonal power by exploring one of the most underrated yet transformative practices of the silent mindset: the art of deep, intentional listening. In a culture where speaking is associated with dominance, intelligence, and influence, listening has been wrongly devalued as passive or submissive. But this chapter challenges that narrative by asserting that true listening is one of the most active, strategic, and empowering skills a person can develop. It opens with the idea that most people don't listen to understand, they listen to reply, to defend, or to impress. Often, while someone else is talking, we're rehearsing our response, waiting for a pause, or mentally judging what's being said. This reactive listening is not only shallow but corrosive to trust, intimacy, and clarity. The silent mindset, by contrast, calls for listening that is present, curious, and non-interruptive listening not just to words but to tone, emotion, silence, and what remains unsaid. When we listen without speaking, we shift the center of gravity from ego to awareness. We stop trying to control the conversation and begin to receive its full depth. This chapter demonstrates how genuine listening can calm conflict, build credibility, and create space for deeper truths to emerge. In personal relationships, this kind of listening makes others feel seen and valued. In professional settings, it distinguishes true leaders from reactive talkers. The chapter draws from fields like psychology, negotiation, and leadership communication to show how listening is not a passive role but a commanding presence. When we are fully attentive, others tend to speak more honestly, disarm defensiveness, and even find clarity themselves simply by being heard. Listening without speaking also allows us to observe more accurately people's inconsistencies, their emotional states, their deeper motives, insights we miss when we're focused on dominating the exchange. The chapter introduces the concept of listening beyond language, which involves tuning into body language, energy, eye movement, and pauses, noticing what's emotionally true even if it contradicts what's verbally said. It's in these quiet observations that empathy and discernment are born. But the practice is not always easy. It requires patience, humility, and a willingness to let go of the need to be right or validated. Many people equate silence in conversation with weakness or lack of knowledge, but the chapter reframes silence as strategic power: the silence of restraint, the silence of reflection, the silence that invites truth. One section details how people tend to fill silence quickly to avoid discomfort, but the silent mindset embraces those moments as fertile ground for deeper connection or self-awareness. The longer we can remain present without rushing to fill the space, the more we learn about others and ourselves. The chapter also touches on internal listening, how most people can't listen well to others because they've never learned to truly listen to themselves. Instead of reacting to their own emotions with distraction or suppression, disciplined listeners learn to sit with discomfort, hear the signals beneath their impulses, and use silence as a space to process rather than escape. This inner listening becomes the foundation for authentic outer listening. The chapter then explores how technology and modern communication habits have eroded our listening capacity, Constant notifications, multitasking, and superficial social exchanges have rewired our brains for fragmented attention, making true listening feel unfamiliar or even exhausting. But with consistent practice, such as device-free conversations, conscious eye contact, and intentional pauses before responding, we can rebuild the neural pathways that allow for deep, focused presence. The chapter gives several practical exercises. The 2-minute mirror, where you let someone speak uninterrupted for 2 full minutes without reacting. The name the feeling method, where you reflect back what you sense emotionally rather than just logically, and the pause and breathe approach, where you wait 3 seconds before responding to give space for full comprehension. These techniques are simple but powerful, and they rewire us toward presence, which is the heart of all meaningful communication. Additionally, the chapter explores the psychological benefit of being a listener, how it enhances our capacity for empathy, reduces our need for validation, and strengthens our self-esteem not by performance but by connection. When we become the kind of person who can hold space for others without needing to dominate it, we become trusted, respected, and sought after in every circle, professionally, personally, and emotionally. The chapter also warns against performative listening, where someone appears attentive but is inwardly disengaged or judgmental. True listening is felt by the speaker. It involves authenticity, not technique. At its highest level, listening becomes a form of service, the willingness to temporarily suspend our own agenda to be fully present for another's truth. And in doing so, we often uncover deeper parts of our own truth. By the end of the chapter, it becomes clear that listening without speaking is not about being voiceless. It's about choosing when your voice serves best and when silence speaks louder. It's about transforming conversations from battlegrounds of opinion to shared spaces of understanding. In a world where everyone wants to be heard but few want to hear, those who listen become rare and powerful. They learn more, judge less, and connect deeper. They become the quiet catalysts of transformation. Listening without speaking ends with a challenge: to spend an entire day listening more than you speak, not just to people but to your environment, your emotions, your body, your breath, and to notice how the world changes when you stop trying to control it with your voice and instead meet it with your full attention. In this space of deep, receptive stillness, the silent mindset is no longer a concept. It becomes a way of being, a subtle form of mastery, and a gift we give both to others and ourselves. Chapter 5, Power and Restraint, explores one of the core paradoxes of the silent mindset, that true strength often lies not in expression, domination, or force, but in the ability to hold back, to pause, to withhold the impulse to react, and to choose deliberate inaction when it serves a greater clarity or purpose. In a world that glorifies the loudest voice, the boldest move, and the most immediate reaction, restraint is often misunderstood as weakness, indecision, or fear. But this chapter dismantles that myth by showing that restraint is a radical act of control, confidence, and conscious self-mastery. It begins by revealing how much of human suffering, conflict, and regret stems from unrestrained behavior. Words spoken in anger, decisions made in haste, promises broken under pressure, or actions taken without full understanding. While we often associate power with doing, true inner power is often expressed through not doing, through the strength to sit in discomfort, to let others speak, to allow events to unfold without needing to insert ourselves, control outcomes, or prove something. The chapter argues that restraint is not the absence of power, it is its refinement. To restrain is not to repress but to contain, to focus energy rather than disperse it chaotically. Drawing from examples in martial arts, military leadership, negotiation, and even parenting, the chapter illustrates that those who act only when it matters, who conserve their voice and their energy, and who time their movements with wisdom, often achieve far more than those who exhaust themselves with constant reaction and expression. It explores how restraint allows for better timing, deeper listening, greater respect from others, and most importantly, greater respect for oneself. It presents restraint not as an act of submission but of sovereignty. When you are no longer ruled by your impulses, you become unshakable, not because you control others but because you govern yourself. This kind of inner discipline builds trust, especially in leadership and relationships, where people instinctively sense who is grounded and who is reactive. The restrained individual is often perceived as wise, mature, and emotionally intelligent, not because they are always right, but because they don't waste energy proving themselves right. The chapter also dives into the neuroscience of emotional regulation, showing how the brain's prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for judgment and impulse control, can be strengthened through conscious acts of restraint, such as pausing before replying, letting go of the need to win an argument, or refusing to act from anger. Each moment of restraint becomes a mental repetition, rewiring the brain to choose thoughtful response over impulsive reaction. This leads into a discussion of response gaps, the space between trigger and reaction, and how learning to expand that gap is one of the most powerful tools for building resilience, reducing conflict, and making better decisions. The chapter gives several real-world scenarios. Someone tempted to send an angry message but waits 24 hours and realizes it's unnecessary. A leader who sits quietly in a meeting full of egos and ends up commanding more attention by saying less. A parent who chooses silence instead of lecturing, and in doing so, fosters more trust with their child. These aren't moments of avoidance. They're moments of high-stakes wisdom, where restraint becomes the space in which the most powerful choices are made. The chapter emphasizes that restraint does not mean silence in all cases, nor does it imply inaction where action is required. Rather, it's the ability to discern when action comes from clarity versus compulsion, when words are rooted in wisdom rather than emotional overflow. It acknowledges that restraint is difficult, especially in a reactive culture that rewards speed, instant replies, and emotional exhibitionism, but shows how those who practice restraint become less manipulated by urgency, provocation, or ego. It also addresses the fear that restraint can lead to passivity or repressed emotion, clarifying that emotional health includes expressing feelings, but with intention, timing, and integrity. Emotional restraint doesn't mean bottling things up. It means choosing how and when we release, to ensure our expression serves growth rather than destruction. There is power in restraint because it gives us control not just over our behavior, but over the narratives others build about us. When we don't reveal all our thoughts or react predictably, we retain a kind of mystery, stability, and gravitas that over-explaining can erode. In fact, one of the key points in the chapter is that restraint creates focus. Just as too much talking dilutes meaning, too much action dilutes impact. The silent mindset knows that conserving energy, attention, and emotional output for what really matters is not just efficient, it's transformative. The chapter draws a parallel to archery. Pulling back the bowstring is restraint, the stillness before release is preparation, and when the arrow is finally let go, it flies with direction and force because of the energy that was held, not scattered. Restraint, then, becomes the bowstring of our lives, tight, quiet, tense with possibility. The chapter closes with a reflection on how restraint is often the most dignified form of strength in a noisy world. It leaves the reader with a challenge to experiment with restraint for a single day, to speak less, pause more, react slower, and ask in every moment, is this necessary? Is this helpful? Is this coming from calm or compulsion? Over time, these moments of quiet power accumulate into a presence that others feel, trust, and respect, not because it demands attention but because it commands it silently. In restraint, we find something greater than control, we find composure. And from composure, everything else becomes possible. Chapter 6, The Quiet Leader, explores the powerful yet often underestimated role of silent leadership in a world that tends to equate charisma with volume, authority with dominance, and effectiveness with visibility. In contrast to the typical model of leadership that values constant speaking, decisive action, and high-profile performance, the quiet leader operates from a place of inner strength, deep listening, and steady presence. This chapter redefines leadership not as the loudest voice in the room but as the calmest, most grounded presence. The person who creates stability in uncertainty, who inspires trust not through forceful motivation but through consistency, clarity, and character. It challenges the cultural belief that leadership requires extroversion, ego, or control, and instead argues that true leadership begins with self-leadership. The ability to manage one's own thoughts, emotions, and impulses before trying to influence others. The quiet leader does not seek attention but earns respect by embodying values rather than broadcasting them. They speak less but with precision, act less frequently but with greater impact, and know that presence is often more powerful than performance. The chapter draws from real-world examples of figures in history, business, activism, and community life who led profound change not through aggressive speeches or dramatic gestures, but through stillness, humility, and unwavering principle. These leaders didn't overpower rooms, they anchored them. Their strength wasn't in how much they said but in how much they noticed, how well they listened, and how deeply they understood the moment before making a move. This chapter emphasizes that the quiet leader listens first, not just to words but to people's emotional states, fears, and unspoken needs. They observe dynamics, ask thoughtful questions, and speak with intention, often influencing others more by how they make them feel than by what they say. Quiet leaders aren't passive, they're strategic. Their silence is not absence but presence. Their pauses are not indecision but deliberation. They create psychological safety by not reacting impulsively, by holding space for others to be heard, and by showing emotional stability even under pressure. In doing so, they model the very behavior they wish to see in others. This kind of leadership is built on restraint, empathy, and focus, not ego, manipulation, or control. The chapter explores how quiet leaders make decisions slowly and communicate clearly, avoiding the kind of reactive decision-making that leads to confusion or distrust. They lead with questions more than answers, knowing that asking the right question often unlocks more wisdom than giving a rushed solution. They understand that influence is not about controlling outcomes but about creating environments where others can rise. Unlike traditional leaders who might depend on charisma or authority to carry their influence, quiet leaders earn their influence through trust, consistency, and alignment with their values. This chapter also addresses the misconception that quiet leaders are weak or indecisive. On the contrary, their composure gives them the mental space to see clearly when others panic, to act deliberately when others react emotionally. The quiet leader uses stillness to assess a situation fully before stepping forward, and that very timing gives their actions more weight. Their words are remembered not because they're loud, but because they're rare and deliberate. The chapter dives into the neuroscience of leadership, showing how leaders who regulate their nervous systems through silence, breath, and thought discipline can help co-regulate their teams, setting the emotional tone for an entire group. Quiet leaders create cultures of calm, which leads to better collaboration, more thoughtful innovation, and reduced conflict. Their lack of performative leadership allows others to drop their defenses and bring their best thinking forward. The chapter includes real-world strategies, leading meetings by speaking last, holding intentional silence before responding in tense situations, choosing moments of stillness before decisions, and creating space for team members to express ideas without fear of being overshadowed. These are not signs of disengagement, but intentional leadership tools. Quiet leaders create strong followings because they build credibility over time. They don't need to convince others of their competence, it's felt in how they carry themselves. Their humility creates room for others to contribute, and their strength comes from alignment with purpose rather than performance. This chapter also emphasizes that being a quiet leader doesn't mean never speaking, never acting, or always avoiding conflict. It means choosing the right moments to speak, to act, and to assert. It means learning the power of saying less but meaning more, of leading from within rather than from the front. Quiet leaders are not spectators. They are architects of energy, pacing, and psychological clarity. They often accomplish more by doing less because they focus on what matters most and remove the rest. The chapter concludes by suggesting that the future of leadership belongs to those who can master inner silence, manage their emotional landscape, and create space for others to rise. In a noisy, distracted, anxious world, the quiet leader is not behind, they are ahead. Their ability to stay grounded when others are triggered, to hold vision when others chase trends, and to lead by example rather than ego makes them rare and powerful. The chapter ends by challenging the reader to adopt quiet leadership in their own life, regardless of title or role, not just in boardrooms or organizations but in families, friendships, communities, and self-dialogue. It asks, how can you lead with less noise and more presence? Where can you model calm instead of control? What if your greatest power isn't in what you say but in how you listen, how you act, and how consistently you stay aligned with your inner truth? In answering these questions, the reader begins to understand that the most respected leaders are not always the ones who speak the most, but those who know when to stay silent, and whose silence carries the greatest weight. Chapter 7, Practical Silence, brings the principles of the silent mindset from theory into action, demonstrating how silence can be integrated into everyday life as a tool for mental clarity, emotional regulation, meaningful communication, and personal transformation. While previous chapters focused on the mindset and philosophical grounding of silence, this chapter addresses the common question, how do I live this out? Offering specific, tangible strategies to make silence a living, breathing part of one's daily routine. It begins by redefining silence not as merely the absence of noise, but as a conscious space we create to separate signal from static, whether mental, emotional, social, or digital. The chapter emphasizes that silence is not something we wait for, it's something we make, and in a world designed to fill every gap with stimulation, silence must be crafted with intention. It explores the different layers of practical silence: outer silence, reducing external input; inner silence, calming the mental chatter; and relational silence, pausing before speaking or reacting, showing how each level supports the others in developing stillness as a core strength. One of the foundational practices introduced is the microsilence, intentional moments of pause throughout the day that act as mental resets. These might be 30 seconds of deep breathing between tasks, a brief pause before entering a meeting, a few quiet moments upon waking or before sleep, or simply taking a breath before responding in conversation. The cumulative effect of these small silences helps recondition the nervous system and teach the mind to find stillness without needing total isolation. In addition to these micro-practices, the chapter introduces digital silence, deliberate periods of disconnection from phones, social media, and constant information consumption. It argues that in modern life, one of the greatest sources of mental noise is digital overload, and reclaiming control over our attention begins with creating clear boundaries around technology. Readers are encouraged to begin with short time blocks of no screen time each day and gradually expand into longer stretches, like a full hour in the morning or evening, or even a digital Sabbath once a week. This kind of silence is not about deprivation but about detox, removing what numbs or distracts us so we can reconnect with ourselves. The chapter also explores relational silence, which is the practice of choosing when not to speak, especially in emotionally charged situations. It provides real-life examples of how silence in conflict, silence during someone else's emotional release, or silence in the face of provocation can de-escalate tension, protect relationships, and deepen trust. In this context, silence becomes an act of strength, empathy, and patience, not withdrawal but intentional presence. Alongside these interpersonal applications, the book discusses reflective silence, making time regularly to sit with one's thoughts without needing to solve, fix, or produce anything. This could be through meditation, journaling, prayer, nature walks, or just sitting in quiet without stimulation. Reflective silence allows buried emotions, intuitive insights, and suppressed truths to rise to the surface, making space for integration and personal growth. The chapter reinforces that reflective silence isn't always comfortable. Sometimes what emerges is restlessness, boredom, or emotional discomfort, but that these are necessary signals from within that we often miss because we're too busy running, scrolling, or talking. By remaining in that silence even briefly, we begin to reconnect with the deeper self, the part that is calm, aware, and wise beneath the noise. Practical silence also explores how to create silent spaces in your environment, even in busy homes or offices. This may mean setting aside a chair, room, or time of day dedicated to stillness, a physical cue to the mind and body that it is time to pause. These spaces don't have to be perfectly quiet. The goal is to designate them as zones of intentional non-reactivity. The chapter touches on how to protect these moments from guilt or external pressure, teaching that making time for silence is not selfish or lazy, it is a powerful act of self-leadership and mental hygiene. The book then explores how silence can be applied to decision-making. Instead of rushing to solve every problem instantly, the silent mindset invites us to sit with the unknown, to wait without forcing clarity, trusting that insight often arises when we stop trying to force it. This approach may seem slow, but it prevents poor decisions made from panic or pressure and helps us align our actions with deeper values. The chapter also provides a framework for using silence before speaking, especially in situations where clarity, authority, or care is needed. Pausing before answering a question, responding to feedback, or addressing conflict not only strengthens one's presence, but signals emotional maturity. In teams, families, and leadership settings, this kind of pause can shift the emotional tone and invite others into a more thoughtful space. In the final sections, the chapter addresses common barriers to practicing silence: internal resistance, guilt, time scarcity, and the discomfort of doing nothing. It encourages readers to start small, just 1 or 2 minutes at a time, and gradually build a rhythm that feels natural. It emphasizes that silence is not about becoming passive or emotionless but about reclaiming space from constant reaction. It's about learning to respond rather than impulsively react, to listen deeply before contributing, and to reconnect with the inner compass that so often gets drowned out by the volume of daily life. The chapter concludes by reminding us of that silence, when practiced deliberately, becomes a source of nourishment, not a break from life but a return to it. In a culture obsessed with speed, talking, achievement, and always being on, practical silence becomes a revolutionary act, one that allows us to live more fully, think more clearly, and connect more deeply with ourselves and the people around us. It is not a luxury, it is a necessity for anyone seeking to live with intention, strength, and presence. With regular practice, silence shifts from something we visit occasionally to a home we carry within us, steady, spacious, and always available no matter how loud the world becomes. Chapter 8, Building the Silent Mindset, serves as the culmination of the entire book by guiding the reader toward integrating the principles of silence into a coherent, sustainable way of being, transforming silence from a temporary practice into a lifelong internal posture. This chapter is not about perfection but about construction, laying the psychological, emotional, and behavioral foundation upon which the silent mindset can be built and expanded day by day. It emphasizes that building this mindset is a personal, patient journey that requires intentional choices, self-honesty, and a deep commitment to inner alignment. It begins by reinforcing the idea that the silent mindset is not about muting we or detaching from the world, but about developing the capacity to live from a place of grounded clarity in a world addicted to noise, reaction, and distraction. The chapter outlines how this mindset is developed not in grand gestures, but in small, consistent practices, pausing before responding, choosing presence over performance, embracing stillness over stimulation, and holding space for discomfort rather than rushing to escape it. To build this mindset, we must retrain our relationship with silence, not seeing it as a void or absence, but as a rich field of potential where clarity, strength, and truth emerge. The chapter invites the reader to take inventory of their current mental patterns. How much of their day is spent in reactivity, noise, digital distraction, internal dialogue, or unnecessary speech? How often do they create stillness on purpose? This awareness becomes the groundwork for transformation. From here, the book introduces a four-pillar framework for cultivating the silent mindset: awareness, restraint, intention, and integration. Awareness involves watching the mind and emotions without judgment, observing thoughts, triggers, urges to speak or react, and recognizing when we are being pulled by noise rather than guided by presence. Restraint is the deliberate act of choosing when not to react, pausing, holding space, delaying gratification, and remembering that silence is often the highest form of intelligence in a charged moment. Intention means aligning our actions and words with clarity and purpose, speaking when it adds value, acting when it's rooted in integrity, and withdrawing when energy is being wasted on things outside our control. And integration means stitching silence into the fabric of our life, not just as a practice but as a principle, letting it influence how we wake up, how we work, how we love, how we rest, and how we lead. The chapter stresses that building the silent mindset is not about control in the rigid sense, but about internal freedom, the kind that allows us to be in chaos without becoming chaotic, to be surrounded by noise yet remain composed, to be challenged yet not reactive. It's a state of leadership over the self, not by suppressing emotion but by processing it wisely, not by avoiding conflict but by navigating it skillfully. The book offers practical strategies for strengthening each pillar: journaling to increase awareness, breathwork and mental reframing to develop restraint, morning intention setting to create conscious direction, and regular self-check-ins to ensure integration. The chapter explains that the silent mindset can be practiced in any environment: by the teacher in a noisy classroom who responds with presence instead of frustration, by the executive who listens instead of interrupting, by the parent who pauses instead of yelling, by the student who chooses focus over distraction, or the friend who sits with someone in pain without rushing to fix them. The mindset is universal because it is human. It taps into our deepest capacity for emotional intelligence, reflection, and conscious engagement. The chapter also acknowledges setbacks. There will be days when silence feels out of reach, when reactivity returns, when the mind storms and louder than ever, and this is not failure but feedback. Each time we return to silence after distraction, we strengthen the habit. Each time we choose a pause over a reaction, we train our nervous system to favor stillness. The book emphasizes that consistency matters more than intensity. 10 seconds of mindful silence practiced regularly will reshape your inner landscape far more effectively than an hour of stillness once a month. The chapter encourages creating rituals of silence: silent mornings, tech-free evenings, midday resets, or even a sacred pause practiced during conflict, to anchor the silent mindset in everyday routines. It also introduces the idea of embodied silence, where silence isn't just mental or verbal but radiates through body language, facial expression, presence, and energy. People can feel the silent mindset when they're around someone who has it. Someone who doesn't need to speak to be heard, who doesn't need to prove themselves to feel worthy, who doesn't rush to fill space because they are the space. The chapter returns to the theme that silence is not the absence of power but its most refined form. It allows us to listen deeply, to observe patterns others miss, to act with intention, and to rest in our own presence without chasing validation. In a world where people are consumed by urgency, speed, and proving, the silent mindset is a quiet revolution, a declaration that we will not be ruled by noise, nor drowned in reaction, nor defined by what we say, but by the presence we bring to every moment. It concludes by reminding the reader that the silent mindset is not something we arrive at once and for all. It's a lifelong practice, a direction rather than a destination, a daily choosing of stillness over reaction, presence over performance, and meaning over noise. The final message is that this mindset, once built, becomes the foundation for everything else in life: clearer relationships, deeper focus, better decisions, stronger leadership, and a lasting sense of inner peace. The silent mindset, in the end, is not about being quiet. It's about becoming unshakably aligned, deeply aware, and profoundly alive, not because the world is silent but because you are. Conclusion. The conclusion of the silent mindset serves not merely as a wrap-up, but as a powerful invocation, an invitation for the reader to begin truly embodying the inner transformation that has been patiently laid out across the book's chapters, reminding us that silence is not the absence of life, but its quiet source. It reflects on the journey from uncovering the noise within, through choosing stillness, disciplining thought, practicing mindful listening, learning restraint, understanding quiet leadership, embracing practical silence, and finally building the mindset into something durable and living within us. The book does not suggest that silence is the goal, but rather the gateway, a doorway into clarity, strength, freedom, and depth that most of us have never been taught to access. This final chapter reiterates that the silent mindset isn't about becoming someone else, or pretending to be stoic or suppressing emotion. It is about becoming more you, the version of yourself that lives beneath reaction, beyond habit, underneath the layers of social conditioning and egoic noise. It's about coming home to yourself in a world that constantly pulls you outward. The conclusion makes it clear that this mindset is revolutionary not because it changes how loud we are, but because it changes how present we are, how we relate to thought, time, tension, others, and ourselves. It emphasizes that silence is a practice, yes, but also a mirror. It reflects the parts of us we might have neglected, avoided, or buried under endless distraction. As we cultivate silence, we begin to uncover things: our deeper fears, our truest desires, the inner narratives we didn't know were running us. And while this process can be uncomfortable at first, it is also liberating, because it allows us to choose our responses rather than be governed by unconscious noise. The silent mindset, as the book reiterates, is not a rejection of sound or speech. It is a declaration that not all sound is meaningful and not all words are needed. It is the reclaiming of our attention, our time, our energy, and our emotional clarity in an age where they are constantly under siege. This mindset gives us the strength to be steady when others are reactive, to be intentional when others are impulsive, to stay grounded in the face of urgency, and to resist the false pressures to perform or conform. The conclusion also encourages us to remember that silence is deeply relational. It affects not only us but everyone we interact with. When we show up grounded, present, and calm, we create a ripple effect. People feel safer, more seen, more heard. We stop dominating conversations and start creating space for dialogue. We stop reacting and start truly understanding. This subtle transformation can improve our families, our workplaces, our communities, not by force but by example. The book closes with a compassionate acknowledgement that building and sustaining the silent mindset is not always easy in a world that rewards noise. There will be moments when we forget, when we slip, when the noise feels louder than our strength, but that's okay. The silent mindset isn't perfection, it's persistence. Every time we pause before reacting, every time we choose to listen without rushing in, every time we retreat into intentional stillness even for a few seconds, we are strengthening the silent foundation that anchors us. The book reminds us that the power of silence is cumulative. What begins as a quiet choice becomes a pattern, a habit, a worldview, a way of life. Over time, we stop chasing peace and begin radiating it. We stop waiting for stillness to arrive from the outside and begin generating it from within. And when silence becomes our foundation, we can carry it into anything: leadership, parenting, conflict, creativity, grief, joy, because it gives us the spaciousness to respond rather than react, to discern rather than assume, to act from wholeness rather than insecurity. The conclusion paints silence not as emptiness but as fullness, not as absence but as depth, not as weakness but as mastery. In a world addicted to stimulation, silence becomes strength. In a world of distraction, it becomes clarity. In a world of endless talking, it becomes wisdom. The final call is both gentle and firm. Carry this mindset with you, not as an idea but as a way of being. Don't just visit silence when life forces you to. Build a relationship with it. Let it walk beside you. Let it teach you. Let it refine you. Let it hold you steady in a world that is always moving too fast. And most importantly, let it remind you that your greatest strength is not how loud you can be, but how clearly you can hear. Your thoughts, your values, your truth, and the quiet voice of intuition that lives beneath all the noise. You don't need to chase attention, react to every impulse, or prove anything to anyone. You already have what you need. And in the silence you will find it. Again and again.